They synapse with nerve fibers at their base. So those cells synapse to fibers on my cochlear nerve, which send the impulses, aka the action potentials, for the vibrations, which the brain is going to be able to interpret as sound. Now, here's the cool thing about how this works. When the waves enter that auditory canal, nerve signals are going to exit the inner ear. It's up to our middle ear to connect the two. We need to make sure we protect ourselves from loud noise, which the perilymph is going to do a lot of that. Now, here's what's cool. The waves push on the tympanic membrane, which pushes on the ossicles, which push on the perilymph, which puts pressure on the vestibular membrane, which pushes down on the endolymph of the cochlear duct, which pushes down on the basilar membrane, which pushes on the perilymph. And my cilia, those stereocilia, are going to bend. Now, based upon action potentials up to this point, cells across the plasma membrane had a lot of sodium on the outside, that when the action potential got started, sodium rushes in and causes the cell to do something. Is that correct? Should have learned that in part 1. But that's what happens. For this action potential, for when those cilia bend, okay, the little projections into the tectorial membrane, this time they're higher in potassium. So when they bend and we begin the action potential, we are now dependent on the chemical gradient, because that is an action potential. An action potential is dependent on the ions that can flow across a plasma membrane. For these cells, we are dependent on the gradient of potassium. So therefore, the action potential is dependent on potassium.
For the potassium ion, is it the missing electron that allows it to connect to whatever it is in the cell to pass through?
In thinking about a plasma membrane, something usually has to happen. It is actually the ions, whether sodium or potassium, that when that something, like for example a neurotransmitter, when it attaches and opens the gate, the ions get to cross in or out.
So it's just like regular potassium. You wouldn't be able to get like that. It has to be like potassium ion. So like lacking or...
Oh, okay, so you're thinking about...
Well, yeah, I'm more like, because it's K plus, right? So K plus.
Yes, so K plus.
Lacking with -1 electron.
Now, do you happen to know how we get that in our bodies?
That's the
because that is something that's extremely important when we talk, whenever you hear the term action potential. The functions at the cellular level, those pluses and minuses are so important. Do you happen to know how we get those?
It's electrolytes, but
It's electrolyte. And that's usually how it's touted to us, okay? But does everyone truly understand how we get electrolytes and why they're so important?
I'm assuming they're important because it looks like they power our cell
Power
action.
everything. Okay, let's think about this for a second. Do you think back to part 1, all right? Probably roughly chapter 2, I think it is. And they start talking about the chemistry. Do you guys remember that? Hopefully, they talk to you about different types of bonds. For example, covalent bonds, hydrogen bonds, ionic bonds, okay? We get the pluses and the minuses by intake of salts. Now, when we think of salt, now when I was growing up, the only salt we had was like the Morton salt, the one little girl in the umbrella. Okay, you had the spout, and you had the little Tupperware salt and pepper shakers. I don't know if anybody remembers that. I'm way too old. And that was our salt. All right, and it would say either iodized or not. Happen to know why iodized is important?
gone through the process of making it into an ion, so it's easier to
Iodized is referring to iodine.
Oh, okay.
Iodine is important for proper function of your thyroid. And seriously, you went to the store, that was the only salt you saw. Now, when you go to the store, what do you see for your choices in salt? You see salt.
And that pink salt.
The pink salt, the Himalayan. I don't know what all kind of salts they got out there. Salts are a combination of elements from the periodic table where one element is from the, like if I'm looking at the periodic table, you guys know how you've got like your metals, your gases, your transition, the lanthanide, actinide series, okay? Salts are going to be a combination of a metal and something that's not. So something from the left to the right. It's usually represented as being sodium to chlorine, a metal to a non-metal. Put them together, they precipitate out into what we know as salt. Okay? When we consume it, now for them to come together and precipitate out, somebody had to give up an electron. One of them had to accept it. Does everybody remember that? They either gain or lose, okay? If they lose an electron, they get a negative. No, positive.
Positive.
If they gain the electron, they get the negative.
Anions and cations.
So, if I take that and I form the salt, and then we put salt into a water environment,
That's okay.
okay, i.e. our bodies, the pluses and the minuses break apart because they get surrounded by water molecules, and now each individual element that made up that salt, it's more than just sodium and potassium. When you take in salt, salt contains sodium, potassium, magnesium. It contains a lot of elements. The body breaks that apart, and they now move around as the plus or the minus. You have a plus and a minus that generates electricity. Now, that is the basis for every single thing that happens in your body. Because the pluses and the minuses generate electricity. What did I just say? We were dependent upon to create the action potential for hearing.
Potassium ion.
And potassium is a plus, and therefore can generate energy. Isn't that what an action potential is?
Yes.
Yes.
This might be a weird question. So if somebody has like significantly low potassium, I know like they can have seizures, but how does that?
It's going to affect everything in their body that's dependent on potassium.
But specifically with hearing, with that?
It would slow it down.
Okay.
Now, all other processes in your body depend on these pluses and minuses. Meaning, i.e., muscle contraction. Skeletal muscle? Is that the only one we have? No. I've got smooth muscle. I got cardiac. All of them dependent. Nerve transmission. I'm dependent on calcium. I'm dependent on potassium. I'm dependent on chlorines. Do you see where I'm going with this? When you see a lab report, and it may show potassium too high, too low, calcium too high, too low, the body has effects that are going to happen. And that's why the person is there. They're sick because whatever has happened with those electrolytes are out of balance, and because it affects more than just one thing in the body, bada bing, bada boom, cell not working, organism not working. This is the, I'm so glad y'all asked it. This is the basis of everything you're going to need the minute you walk out of my door and go to another class. You understand this, you're going to understand everything you need to know. Because y'all are going to be looking at lab reports. Y'all are going to be with the doctor who's going to have to say, well, you know, I'm showing a calcium deficiency or surplus, whatever the case might be. They got to deal with the effects that are happening in the rest of the body that can include and leading up to death. Yes, no, maybe. Cool. Who knew y'all were going to get that kind of answer about the electrolyte? When that tip bends on that little kinocilium, that little stereocilium, it allows potassium to move, it allows the action potential to get started, and it allows us to have hearing.